You have no idea who you're dealing with. My authority in this room is absolute. You would do well to remember that.
You wandered into the wrong charity ball, sweetheart. That sentence found Amara Diallo at 7:48 on a Friday evening in April, in the back corner of a Washington ballroom, 3 feet from a silver ice sculpture of the Washington Monument, holding a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking. The man who said it was a lieutenant general of the United States Army. He had silver at the temples, the perfect posture of a man who had spent 30 years being photographed from below, and a smile that believed it owned every room it entered. The room did, in fact, believe that smile owned it. Catering uses the service entrance, honey. He did not point, but his chin gestured at the marble archway behind her. A few wives nearby made a closely studied show of not laughing. They failed. "Franklin," murmured one of them, "be kind. The poor thing is probably lost." He did not hear her, or he heard her and decided the pity made the joke funnier. He took one step closer. "What outfit are you with, exactly?" Amara Diallo set her glass of water down on the bar without a single sound. She was wearing olive green tonight, a borrowed gown, because the yellow she had first laid out on her bed at 4 in the afternoon had felt too loud for a room full of men whose flags had crossed her shoulder 9 years ago. She had chosen green because the dress had belonged to the late wife of the man who ran the dry cleaners 2 blocks from her fabric shop, and because green was the color her mother used to wear to church in Thiers, and because, most quietly of all, green was the color of the night vision tubes she had learned to see through when the world turned into a black room full of screaming men. She looked up at the silver-haired general, and she gave him the smallest courtesy of a smile. "I am not with any outfit, sir. I was invited." He tilted his head. "By whom?" "By the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, sir." He did not laugh now. He smiled. It was worse. "And your name, sweetheart, since you're on the guest list?" "Diallo." "Diallo," he repeated, tasting it like wine he had decided was not to his liking. "First name?" "Amara." "Good Lord," he said to the men near him, not to her. "Amara? Wonderful. Amara. Am I right in saying you came in through the front?" He did not wait for her to confirm. "Smart girls in catering usually come in through the side door, you know. They save us all time." He reached toward her bare shoulder as if he were going to pat her there. The lazy, friendly pat men give women they have already decided are beneath them. "Go on. What rank were you thinking when you were daydreaming about a uniform like this one?" He gestured, loosely, at the forest of fruit salad on his own chest. A small, congested laugh went around the room. 2 phones rose. Amara did not answer his question. She did not tell him her rank. She did not correct him. She did not any of the 11 different things she could have done that would have ended his night in 3 words. She set her glass a 1/4 inch further from his reaching hand. She looked once more at his silver temples, at the lines of a face that had never been in any fight that lasted longer than a press conference. And she did the only thing that an old warrior does when the room is full of children playing soldier. She waited. She waited because, 9 years ago, on a freezing plateau in northern Burkina Faso, a young Nigerian-American sergeant named Jabari Okonkwo had taught her something she had never forgotten. And the lesson was not in any field manual. He had told her, 4 hours into a firefight that was already eating them alive, "Cap, don't bring the mountain down on them yet. Let them climb." She let the general climb. To understand how this moment came to be, you have to leave that ballroom. You have to drive 380 miles north and east, out past the monuments and the highways and the glass and tile monuments to other people's money, out past the suburbs with their identical mailboxes and identical lawns, out into a small town called Ashton in the Maryland foothills, where nobody has ever heard of any admiral or any ball. There is a fabric shop on the corner of Main Street there. It sells wax print and kente and mud cloth and a dozen other cloths that smell faintly of Accra and Abidjan and the Senegalese grandmother who taught its owner how to cut a pattern without measuring. The shop is called Ankara Lane. It is run by a quiet Senegalese-American woman in her early 50s, whose name, in the small economy of the town, is Mrs. Diallo. She keeps the bolts neat. She lets the children come in and feel the cloth without charging them anything. When old Mr. Carter, who is no relation to the general, came in last November, unable to carry a bolt of indigo she had set aside for him, she closed the shop at 4 in the afternoon, drove the cloth to his house in her old station wagon, helped him hang it in his wife's sewing room, refused the $12 delivery fee, and was back behind her counter by 6. That is who Ashton thinks she is. A kind, quiet woman who is good with cloth and patient with old men. She wears long sleeves in every season. If you ask her why, she smiles and says her arms get cold. And she changes the subject so gently that you never notice she did it. Nobody in Ashton knows what those sleeves are hiding. Nobody knows that the woman who cuts cloth for them once did a thing that grown soldiers still whisper about on bases on the other side of the Atlantic, in half a dozen languages, in the small hours before dawn. She likes it that way. She built her whole small life around being unremarkable, because being remarkable had already cost her everything she was not willing to lose again. Every morning before she flips the sign on the door, Amara does one thing. She reaches into the collar of her blouse and closes her fingers around a single, worn metal disc that hangs on a chain against her chest. The name stamped on it is not hers. It belonged to a tall, gap-toothed Nigerian-American kid with 4 sisters in Houston who all called him JB. Corporal Jabari Bachur Okonkwo. The only person on this earth who ever really saw her. She holds the tag for exactly the length of one breath. Then she lets it go and opens the store. And the world sees a woman in a wrap dress. The world does not see the woman who held a ridgeline for 8 hours and did not blink. The envelope came on a Tuesday. It was heavy, cream-colored, stamped with an official seal she had spent 9 years trying to forget. She almost dropped it into the bin under the counter without opening it. When she finally slid it open with a seam ripper at the register, her hand, the steadiest hand the regiment had ever measured, shook just slightly. Inside was a letter that told her the mission on the plateau had finally been declassified after 9 years in the classified vault. It told her that the country now knew what had happened up there, and it told her that in 3 weeks, in Washington, at the Willard Intercontinental, in front of the flags and the cameras, the nation intended to place the Medal of Honor around her neck. She sat down on the stool behind the register and read the letter 4 times. She read about the ribbon and the ceremony and the guest list, and none of it touched her. Then she read the last line, the one that made her put the letter down flat on the counter and press her palm over it. It said the men she had saved would be present. It said the names of the fallen would be read aloud. JB's name, spoken out loud, in a room full of the living. At last, she did not care about the medal. She had spent 9 years not caring about medals. She had a shoebox of citations in the back of a closet she never opened, but she cared about that one line. She cared about JB's name being spoken in the light instead of buried in a file with a stamp on it. So she took a dress out of the back of the closet. She decided at the last minute that it was not right. She borrowed the green one from the widow 2 doors down and made up her mind. She would go. She would say almost nothing. She would hear his name. She would come home and open Ankara Lane on Monday. She did not know yet that she would arrive early, that she would stand quietly by the bar, and that she would be mistaken for the help. She did not know yet who else would be in that room. She did not know about the general 300 miles away. In a life made entirely of marble, Lieutenant General Marcus Whitfield had never once in his career been told to use the service door. He was the kind of officer the Army puts on recruitment posters: silver at the temples, straight as a flagpole, a jaw built for studio lighting. He had commanded divisions and shaken the hands of senators. And this very month, his name had been written up in Army Times as one of 3 finalists for a post so high that only one man in a generation ever occupied it: Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Everyone said the appointment was a formality. Everyone said the 5th star was already in his future. And for years at galas exactly like this one, General Whitfield had told a story. He told it well. He told it about a plateau in the Sahel on the far side of the Atlantic, about a small Army Special Forces element pinned on a rocky shelf with their helicopters grounded and the closest help 500 miles away, about how the enemy had them cold, about how the night had swallowed the horizon, and about how somehow, out of that storm, an unseen figure on a neighboring ridgeline had cut the attackers down one impossible shot at a time until the Americans could climb out alive. He told it because one of the boys in that pinned element had been his own son, Captain Andrew Whitfield. He told it as proof of the thing he loved most in the world, which was the legend of Marcus Whitfield, father of a hero, leader of heroes, a man history was clearly building a pedestal for. He never told the part he did not know. He never told them that the shooter had been a woman. He never told them her rank. The mission had been buried so thoroughly that even he, with all his stars, had only ever heard the shooter's call sign. A pair of soft Yoruba words the survivors spoke like a prayer. Iyami Aje, Mother of War. He would say it at the end of the story, swirling his drink, and the table would go quiet. In 9 years, it had never once occurred to General Whitfield to go looking for Iyami Aje. It had never occurred to him that the person who saved his son might be waiting somewhere in long sleeves, holding a dog tag that was not her own. The legend was useful exactly as it was, faceless and grand, a spotlight that happened to fall on him. So when he walked into that ballroom tonight, glowing, untouchable, 3 months from his appointment, and saw an unfamiliar black woman standing alone by the bar in a green gown, he did not see a hero. He saw someone who did not belong in his room. And he decided, the way powerful men decide 100 small cruelties a day, that it would be amusing to remind her of that. He had told the story of Iyami Aje 100 times. He had never once imagined she would be standing 3 feet away, holding a glass of water while he told her to find the service door. 9 years before the emerald gown, before Ankara Lane, before the long sleeves, there was a plateau with no name that mattered, in a corner of Burkina Faso that the maps barely bothered to label. It was the kind of place countries send their bravest children, and then classify so thoroughly that the bravery never officially happened. Captain Amara Diallo was an Army Special Forces officer then, attached to a small joint operations cell, hunting a network of foreign fighters who had taken a French aid convoy hostage on the Sahel. She was already something the older instructors did not have a word for. She did not shoot the way other people shoot. She shot the way other people breathe, without deciding to. Wind, the slow spin of the earth, the small lie a mirage tells about distance, the way a certain sound carried a half-second longer at altitude. She solved all of it somewhere below thought, and the round went exactly where the math said it would, every single time, until the men around her stopped calling it skill and started calling it something closer to prayer. There were officers who volunteered to spot for her just so they could tell people years later that they had. She had a spotter named Jabari Okonkwo. He was a tall, gap-toothed kid from Houston's 3rd Ward who had gone through basic training on a basketball scholarship he had forgotten how to use. He talked constantly. He laughed at his own jokes. He could read wind through a spotting scope the way ministers in his mother's church read scripture. He was the only person on the planet who was not a little afraid of her. And because of that, he was the only person she loved. He kept a running list of the meals he was going to eat when they got home. He called her the most dangerous introvert in the Western Hemisphere. One slow afternoon in a hide site, bored out of his mind, he had taken a needle and some ink he had not been authorized to carry, and he had bent over her wrist in the half-light with a magnifying lamp. He had traced, freehand, 3 small symbols above the vein: a Gaia Nyame, an Adinkra mark meaning "except God," a tiny shield, and a single line that took him 20 minutes to draw, a careful squiggle that was the signature mark of a fallen Senegalese lieutenant Amara had grown up next to in Dakar. Then, beneath the ink, in tiny letters you had to be 5 inches away to read, he had written a single word: Iyami Aje, Mother of War. It was not a name. It was not a rank. It was, on the nights when the rest of the world had decided that she was not anything at all, the most honest thing anyone had ever said about her. She had rolled her eyes at him. She had called him an idiot. She had also never once in 9 years thought about having it removed. The day everything happened, the small American element got caught on the plateau in a crossfire at the bottom of a valley. 14 men boxed in, taking fire from 3 sides as the night failed. One of them was a 22-year-old captain on his first command named Andrew Whitfield. Though Amara did not know his name and would not learn it for 9 years, what she knew, lying on the ridgeline 2 kilometers above them with her spotter beside her, was that the storm was coming. The aircraft were grounded. The radios were drowning in static. And those 14 men were about to die in the dark while the whole world looked the other way. She and JB were the only angle. 2 people, 1 rifle, 1 spotting scope, on a freezing shelf of rock against a valley full of men who wanted those boys dead. So she went to work. There is no honest way to make what she did that night sound small. The range was obscene. The wind came down the valley in gusts that would have thrown any normal shooter's round a full body's width wide. The light was already gone. And then the storm swallowed even the stars. And still she read the valley through the scope like a page in a book she had already memorized. JB called the wind in a low, steady murmur. "Hold half a value. Now full. Now hold." And she trusted him with her life and the lives of 14 strangers. And she pressed the trigger. And a man who was about to overrun the pinned element simply stopped being a threat. Then another. Then another. For 8 hours, she held that valley closed by will and mathematics. Her hands went past cold into a numbness that frightened even her, and she flexed them one at a time so she would not lose the trigger. Every time the enemy massed to rush the trapped element, a round came out of the impossible dark and took the heart out of the charge. There was a moment, hour 6, when a round cracked so close to her head that grit stung her cheek, and JB's hand landed flat on her back, and he said, "Quiet as anything. You are still here. Keep breathing." And she did. There was one shot that outlived all the others, the one the survivors would argue about for years afterward in bars and VA halls, because none of them could ever make the numbers work. Near midnight, a heavy machine gun crew set up on the lip of the valley, close enough that the first burst would have ended everything. And there was no time and no light and a crosswind tearing straight down the valley. JB breathed the call. Amara did not aim so much as decide. The gun never fired. The men in the valley heard the crack roll down the mountain a full second after the gunner fell. And one of them, a young man named Andrew, put his face in the dirt and wept, because he understood in that instant that somebody up on that mountain was simply refusing to let them die. The Americans in the valley could not see her. They could not raise anyone on the net. But a soft voice told them again and again, in the calmest tone any of them had ever heard, to hold, to breathe, to move on her count. They did not know if the voice was a man or a woman or a prayer. On the radio, someone started calling the shooter Iyami Aje, because Iyami Aje is what you pray to when nothing on earth can help you. And the name stuck to her like blood. She did not miss, not once, not in 8 hours, not in wind, not when her vision blurred and her body begged her to stop. 14 men were breathing in that valley, and every breath was a shot she had not missed. And then, near the end, the mountain found her. An enemy element had climbed the back of the ridge in the storm, hunting the ghost that was gutting them. They found the hide. JB saw them a half-second before she did, and in that half-second, he did the only thing he ever really taught her about war, which had nothing to do with rifles. He put his body between the threat and hers. He shoved her flat and rose up into the danger so she would have the half-second she needed to turn. She ended it. But when the shooting stopped and the wind screamed and she reached for him in the dark, the laughing kid from Houston was already gone. His hand still closed around his spotting scope, his blood freezing on the rock she had defended. She did not fall apart. She could not afford to. Not yet. 14 men were still alive in that valley, and the night was not over. So she pulled JB's dog tag over his head and put it around her own neck, and she went back on the gun alone, her cheek wet and freezing, and she finished the night. When the storm finally broke before dawn and the helicopters could fly, she came down off that ridge on foot to help carry out the last wounded man, because the medevac could not reach him. He was the youngest of them, shot through the leg, half awake. She knelt over him in the gray light and tied off the bleeding with hands that had not stopped being steady even now for maybe 90 seconds. That boy looked up at the person saving his life. He was too far gone to hold her face, but he saw the wrist working the tourniquet close and clear. And inked on that wrist, he saw a tiny Adinkra symbol, a shield, and a small word he would not forget in 9 years and 3 promotions and a wedding and a baby daughter and 100 lonely nights since. Then hands pulled him onto the bird, and when he looked again, she was already gone, back up into the rocks to bring JB home, a shape dissolving into the dark. That boy was Andrew Whitfield, and for 9 years, in every quiet moment, he described the same 3 things to anyone who would listen. A voice that told him to breathe, an accent that had been so calm it had frightened him, and a tiny, worn wrist inked in the dark that he had seen for less than 15 seconds and had not forgotten since. The mission was buried. The valley was scrubbed from every record a civilian could ever reach. Amara went home with a folded flag that was not for a husband and a dog tag that was not her own. And she disappeared into a small town in Maryland and a small fabric shop and a life with long sleeves. The survivors, scattered across the force, did the only thing they could do for a hero they could not name. They pooled their money, the 14 of them, and had a small brass medallion struck at a metalworker's shop in San Antonio. On one side, a ridgeline. On the other, 2 words, Iami Age. Andrew Whitfield carried that medallion in his pocket every day for 9 years, turning it over with his thumb until the edges went smooth, waiting for a chance he had stopped believing would ever come. Neither Amara nor Andrew knew that the chance was 3 weeks away in a ballroom full of chandeliers, and that it would begin with the boy's own father snapping a mocking salute at the mother of war, and asking her with a grin what rank she thought she was. The ballroom. Amara arrived early, on purpose. Crowds were a thing she managed rather than enjoyed, and she wanted to be settled before the room filled. Tucked near the bar with her back to a wall and a clear line to every door. She held a glass of water she did not intend to drink. She counted the exits without meaning to, the way she counted them everywhere, in churches and grocery stores, and now here. She was not there to be seen. She was there to hear one name read aloud and then to go home. She looked that night quietly beautiful. The borrowed green gown fit her like it had been waiting for her all these years in someone else's closet. But she carried herself the way she carried everything, without a single wasted motion. And the officers who drifted past her registered only a calm, striking woman standing alone and moved on. She had spent her whole life being looked at and not seen, and she had made a kind of peace with it. Being invisible had kept her alive more than once. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitfield did not do peace. He did once. He swept into the ballroom with his wife on his arm and a wake of deference behind him. And his eyes moved across the room the way a landlord's eyes move across a property he owns. When they landed on Amara, something in him decided she was a discrepancy. A woman he did not recognize, not on anyone's arm, not in anyone's chain of command, standing in his ballroom as if she had a right to the floor. To a man like Whitfield, that was not a person. That was a small problem to be corrected in front of an audience, for sport. "You wandered into the wrong charity ball, sweetheart." He said the word exactly as he meant it to, soft and filthy with condescension. Amara turned her head slowly. She had heard that tone 10,000 times, from instructors who assumed she would quit, and from adversaries who assumed she would miss. She gave him a small, polite smile. The smile of a woman deciding, for now, to be gracious. "No," she said. "I was invited." He stepped in front of her, cutting her off from the room, and the game began in earnest. "Catering uses the service door, honey. What outfit are you with exactly?" He let his eyes crawl down the green gown and then flicked one finger at the bare curve of her shoulder, at the place where a uniform would carry the weight of a career, as if to point out how empty it was. Around him, a few officers chuckled because he was a general, and laughing along was easy and safe. His wife floated up in lavender silk, sipping champagne, and joined the hunt with the casual cruelty of a woman who had never once in her life been the target of it. "Marcus," she purred, not meaning a single syllable of it. "Be kind. The poor thing is lost." She said it to the little crowd, not to Amara. "The way you talk about a stray dog that has wandered into a nice restaurant." One young officer near the edge of the crowd shifted his weight, uncomfortable, and half opened his mouth as if to say something. Whitfield caught it and waved him down without even turning his head, the way you wave off a waiter who has come at the wrong moment. And the young man closed his mouth and looked down at his shoes. That small surrender settled over the whole crowd. Nobody was going to stop this. His wife leaned toward a friend and said loud enough to Carrie that she simply did not understand how they let just anyone into these things anymore. And the friend laughed behind a ringed hand, and two more phones rose to catch the general being witty. To everyone watching, it looked like exactly what the powerful always want cruelty to look like. Harmless, funny, earned. Here's the thing. The whole laughing room did not understand. Amara Diallo could have ended it with one sentence. She could have said a word or two quietly and watched the color drain out of the general's handsome face right there. She had ended far more dangerous men than him with far less. But she was tired in a way none of them could imagine. Tired down in the marrow. And she had not driven 380 miles to win a fight with a peacock in dress blues. She had come to hear JB's name. So she held still, and she let him talk. And she paid the toll the way people like her have always been made to pay it, with silence and a straight spine. Somewhere behind her ribs, the plateau stirred. The cold, the wind, JB's hand flat on her back, and she breathed it down the way she had trained herself to, and she stayed quiet. "Special Forces," she said, when Whitfield demanded again what she could possibly have been a while ago. It was the truest, most understated thing a human being said in that building all night. He laughed out loud. "You, Special Forces." He said it to the room, not to her. And the room gave him the laugh he wanted. A phone came up at the edge of the crowd, then a second one. Filming the fun. Because a laughing general is content, and content is currency. Emboldened, Whitfield reached for the grand gesture, the thing that would make the story worth retelling at breakfast. He lifted his glass high. "A toast," he announced, "to the Lady Colonel." And then he snapped his heels together and threw her a crisp, mocking salute, holding it, milking it, while the officers around him grinned and the phones drank it in. Not everyone was laughing. Along the wall, an older colonel in dress greens had gone very still, his eyes moving from the halo of laughter to the quiet woman at its center. A small frown gathering. Near the doors, a senior non-commissioned officer with 28 years on his sleeve had set his jaw to stone and folded his arms. They did not yet know who she was. They only knew, the way old soldiers always know, that something about the quiet woman by the bar did not fit the joke being told about her, and that men who mistake stillness for weakness are usually the last ones to find out they were wrong. The older colonel by the wall, the one who had gone still at the start of all this, took one step off the wall and then stopped himself, because he outranked no one here, and a scene would only make it worse for her. He would tell people later that he had never in 40 years wanted so badly to be wrong about what he was watching. He looked at the woman setting down her glass of water and thought, that is not the stillness of someone who is afraid. That is the stillness of someone deciding whether to be merciful. Inside that stillness, Amara was doing the arithmetic she had done her whole life. How much does it cost me to let this go? How much does it cost me to end it? She had learned on a plateau that the loudest answer is almost always silence, and that the men who most deserve to be humbled will usually do the job themselves, if you only give them enough rope and enough time. So she gave him rope. She waited. She let him climb. Whitfield leaned in close, grinning ear to ear, going for the finish. So go on, he said. What rank? Amara set her glass of water down on the bar without a sound. She looked at him. This shining man who had never in his life been cold or afraid or alone on a mountain. This man playing a hero in a room full of medals. And for one moment, 9 years of swallowed grief moved behind her eyes, and then went still again. Higher than yours, sir, she said. She said it quietly. She did not say it as a boast. She said it the way you state a fact that happens to be true, the way you would say the sky is up. And because the room could not imagine a universe in which it was true, the room laughed harder than ever. His wife actually clapped. Delighted, the general wiped a tear of laughter from the corner of his eye, shaking his head at the sheer nerve of this nobody in a green dress, and he reached out one hand to pat her on the cheek. The final insult. The little tap you give a child who has said something adorable and stupid. His fingers brushed past her cheek and grazed her wrist, and the green sleeve, loose at the cuff, slid back 2 inches of skin. A tiny Adinkra symbol, a tiny shield. And beneath them, in a careful hand, 2 words an inch high. Iyami Ajay. The exact ink a dying boy had memorized on the worst night of his life, and had described 10,000 times since. And Lieutenant General Marcus Whitfield, who had told the legend of Iyami Ajay 100 times without ever once looking for her face, finally looked down and saw the exact ink on the wrist of the woman he had just called Catering. The laugh died in his throat like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. For a moment, the general's face did nothing at all, because his mind refused the information. He knew that ink. He had never seen it, and yet he knew it better than his own reflection, because his son had described it to him on 100 late-night phone calls. Tattooed it into the private mythology of the Whitfield family. The Adinkra mark on the wrist of the ghost who came down off the mountain and saved the boy in the valley. The mark of the mother of war. His hand was still in the air, hovering by her cheek. He pulled it back slowly, as if the woman were made of fire, and his mouth opened and produced nothing. Across the ballroom, Captain Andrew Whitfield had been half listening to his father hold court, the way he had learned to half listen years ago. Then he saw the old man's face change, saw the color pour out of it. He followed his father's frozen stare down to a woman's wrist. And Andrew Whitfield, decorated captain, veteran of the worst places on the map, stopped being an officer and became again in one heartbeat a 22-year-old boy dying in a dry valley while a calm voice told him to breathe. He crossed the room without knowing he was moving. People stepped out of his way. He stopped in front of her, and his eyes went from the ink to her face and back, and his mouth worked before any sound came out. Iyami Ajay. It came out cracked and small, the voice of a much younger man. My God, it's you. It's you. Every glass in the room stopped moving. Amara looked at the young man in front of her, at his tears, at the ruined disbelief on his face, and something in her chest that she had kept clamped shut for 9 years shifted half an inch. She had never known his name, but she knew that leg. She had knelt over that leg in the gray light and tied it off with her own 2 hands. And she had spent 9 years not knowing whether the boy at the end of it had lived or died on the flight home. Now here he stood, alive, wearing the rank she had last seen on a stretcher at dawn. You made it off the ridge, Captain, she said quietly.
It was not a question. It was 9 years of a wound she never let herself name, closing over at last. Andrew's hand was already shaking as it went to his pocket. He drew out a small brass medallion, worn smooth at the edges from 9 years of being turned over by a thumb that could not stop. A medallion. A ridgeline on one face, 2 words on the other. He took her hand, the one with the ink, and he pressed the medallion into her palm and closed her fingers around it. And he could barely get the words out. We had these made, he whispered. All of us. The 14. We never knew your name. We never knew your face. We just knew you were real. And we swore we would never stop looking for you. His voice broke completely. Ma'am, I have carried this every single day for 9 years, praying to God I would get to put it in your hand. I have a wife. I have a daughter. They exist because of you. Everything I have exists because of you. And that was the moment the ballroom understood that something enormous was happening, even though most of them still did not know what. Up on the low stage, a 4-star general who had been waiting quietly by the podium set down his own glass and stepped to the microphone. He was the presiding officer of the evening, and he had known exactly who the woman in the green gown was from the second she walked in. And he had watched Whitfield's little performance from across the room with a face like a slowly closing door. He tapped the microphone once. The whole room turned. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, and his voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of that marble hall. We are here tonight for one reason: to finally, publicly, honor an American whose actions were classified for 9 years. He looked directly at Amara. Tonight, this nation awards the Medal of Honor to a United States Army Special Forces captain who held a ridgeline alone through a storm for 8 hours and brought 14 trapped operators home alive. He paused and let the pause do its work. For 9 years, the men she saved knew her only by 2 words. Tonight, we can finally say her name. Captain Amara Diallo. Some of you may know her better by the call sign they gave her on the radio that night. Iyami Ajay, Mother of War. The sound that went through the room was not applause. It was something lower and older than applause. It was 200 professional soldiers sucking in the same breath at the same instant. And then, one by one, beginning to get to their feet. The general kept reading. He read the citation. He read the range and the wind and the 8 hours, and grown officers who had seen everything shook their heads slowly, because they understood better than any civilian ever could
that the numbers he was reading should not be possible. He read the line that made Andrew Whitfield's knees nearly buckle. The line about how, after 8 hours on the gun, the shooter had come down off the ridgeline on foot into the open to carry out the last wounded man by hand because the medevac could not reach him in time. Half the room turned to look at Andrew without meaning to, because half the room had heard him tell that story. The story of the steady hands and the tiny wrist. At one gala or another across 9 years, they had always assumed it was the beautiful exaggeration of a man who had survived something no one should survive. They understood now, all at once, that he had never exaggerated a single word of it. And then he read the part that Amara had driven 380 miles to hear. He read the names of the fallen. And when he reached one name, when he said the words, Corporal Jabari Bachur Okonkwo, United States Army, who gave his life shielding his teammate so that she could continue the fight. Amara Diallo, the woman who had not missed a shot in 8 hours, who had buried her grief in a small town for 9 years, finally closed her eyes and let 2 tears fall down her face. JB's name, spoken aloud, in the light, in a room full of the living, at last. That was all she had ever come for. Everything else in that ballroom was noise. And then the general did the thing that turned the lieutenant general's private disaster into a public one. For those who may have forgotten the tradition, the general said, letting his gaze drift just once, deliberately, to the frozen Whitfield. The Medal of Honor is the one distinction in this country that reverses the salute. Every member of the armed forces, regardless of grade, up to and including the most senior flag officer in this room, renders the first salute to its recipient. Rank does not outrank the medal. Nothing does. Higher than yours. She had told him the truth. She had told him the plainest, most literal truth in the entire building. And he had laughed in her face and reached out to pat her cheek like she was a child. Now the whole room knew it. Now the whole room turned to look at the shining general with the 5th star already in his future. The man who had told the legend of Iyami Ajay at a dozen dinners to make himself glow, and who had just spent 5 minutes mocking her as catering staff in front of 200 witnesses and a dozen raised phones. Andrew was the first to render it. He stepped back, drew himself up to full, rigid attention in front of the woman who had saved his life, and brought his hand up in the slowest, most reverent salute of his career. Tears running openly down his face and off his jaw. Then the older colonel by the wall saluted. Then the senior NCO by the doors. Then, like a tide coming in, the room. 200 people came to attention for the quiet woman in the green gown. A young lieutenant knew the stage was crying and did not care who saw her do it. The bartender. A retired sergeant major who had poured drinks at galas like this for 25 years and had seen every kind of important person there is, sat down his towel and came to attention behind the bar. Even the camera crew hired to film the evening slowly lowered their equipment and stood. In the middle of all that motion, Amara stood perfectly still. The medallion was pressed so hard into her palm that its edges were printing a small ridge line into her own skin, a mark she would find hours later and not remember making. She was not thinking about Whitfield. In the private country behind her eyes, she had already forgiven him and let him go. She was thinking about a boy from Houston who should have been standing right here to see this. And in the middle of that rising tide of respect stood one man who had not moved, could not move, whose hand would not obey him, whose handsome face had gone the exact color of ash. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitfield finally understood that the joke he had told to the whole room was about to become the story the whole world told about him, and that the only way out was to lift his hand and salute the woman he had just humiliated in front of every camera in the building, or refuse and end his career where he stood. He tried to talk his way out of it first. Men like him always try to talk first. "Ma'am," he said, and the word came out strangled. Nothing like the silk he had used on her a minute ago. "I had no idea. We were only having a bit of fun. I never would have if I had known who—" He heard the shape of the sentence forming and could not finish it, because there was no end to it that was not a confession. "If I had known who you were, I would have treated you like a human being." That was the sentence. Every person in that room finished it for him in their heads. And the finishing of it was the worst thing that had ever happened to Marcus Whitfield. Amara let him hang there. She did not rescue him, and she did not stab him. She simply waited, the medallion warm in her closed hand, and let the silence do what silence does to a man who has just run out of charm, in front of the only audience that ever mattered to him. Later, the people who were there would say, the strangest part was how ordinary he suddenly looked, stripped of the room's deference. He was just a graying man in a well-cut uniform who had made a cruel bet in public and lost it in public. The medals on his chest, which had glittered an hour ago, looked all at once like what they actually were. Small pieces of ribbon and metal a committee had chosen to give him. Nothing at all like the single plain star that was about to hang at the throat of the woman he had told to use the service door. He reached out of pure reflex for the easy charm that had carried him through every hard moment of his life, and found the drawer empty. Then she spoke, and she spoke gently, which was somehow far worse for him than shouting would have been. "You did not need to know who I was, General. That is the whole point. You should have been kind to Catering." It was not a taunt. It was not a line built to draw blood. It was a quiet correction from a woman who had earned the right to correct him 10,000 times over. And it landed in that room like a verdict read from a bench. A few people exhaled. Somebody near the back said, "Amen," under their breath, and did not bother to hide it. Whitfield's hand finally came up. He had no choice left. And everyone watching knew he had no choice, which stripped the gesture of the last shred of dignity he might have salvaged from it. He saluted her. The man who had snapped a mocking salute at her 90 seconds earlier now held a real one, stiff and trembling, his eyes wet with something that was not sorrow so much as terror. The pure terror of a man watching his own reflection crack down the middle. He held it, because she outranked the stars on his shoulders, because a small, heavy metal was about to sit at her throat, and his 4 stars would bow to it for the rest of his natural life. Amara returned the salute, crisp, correct, unhurried. She gave him the exact courtesy he had refused her. And in giving it, she made the difference between the two of them a thing no one in that room would ever be able to unsee. That was the whole of her revenge. She was simply, visibly, the better person. And she let 200 witnesses do the math. His wife had already begun to leave him, although she had not yet moved a single step. Sonia Whitfield had spent the evening laughing at the woman in green. She had clapped her manicured hands, and now she stood next to her husband, with the fixed, bright, panicking smile of a woman who had just watched her entire investment catch fire in public. She was not thinking about the hero. She was not thinking about the 14 men, or the plateau, or Jabari Okonkwo. She was thinking about the cameras, about the appointment, about the galas next season, and whether she would still be seated at the good tables, or quietly moved to the bad ones. Slowly, deliberately, she unhooked her hand from Marcus's arm and took one small step sideways, opening a gap of cold air between herself and the man she had married for exactly the future that was now dissolving in front of 200 phones. He noticed. Of course he noticed. It was the loneliest step anyone took all night, and it was taken by the person standing closest to him. The presiding general was still watching from the stage, and his face had already made a decision that would be formalized in careful memos over the following week. There is a phrase in the culture Whitfield had lived inside his entire life: conduct unbecoming. Everyone in that ballroom heard those two words clearly, without anyone speaking them aloud. A man 3 months from the highest post in his service had, on camera, mocked and belittled a Medal of Honor recipient he had mistaken for the help. There was no version of the appointment hearing that survived that footage. There was no committee on earth that would put a 4th star on that shoulder. Now the engraver could put down his tools. By morning, the clip would have a name of its own online, a short and ugly title that would follow him into every room for the rest of his life. By noon, a spokesman would be drafting the first careful sentence of a statement that no one would believe. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, he only had to stand in the wreckage of the room he had ruled an hour ago, and feel the deference drain out of it, person by person, like water out of a cracked glass. His aide, a sharp young lieutenant colonel who had hitched his own career to the general's rising star, was already checking his watch and beginning, somewhere behind his eyes, the quiet work of pretending he had always found the man a little distasteful. Not one person in that room was on his side anymore, and he knew it. But the deepest cut of the whole night did not come from the general, or the cameras, or the wife peeling herself away from his side. It came from his own son. Andrew had not left Amara's side. He stood a half step behind her now, positioned without thinking in the ancient posture of a man guarding something precious. And when his father finally looked at him with the desperate, silent plea of a parent begging a child to make it all stop, Andrew simply shook his head. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only the closest people heard it, and that made it carry further than any shout. "I have carried her medallion for 9 years, Dad," Andrew said. "You told her story at dinner parties to make people admire you. And when she walked into your room, you called her Catering and told her to use the service door." He swallowed hard. "I have wanted to find her my whole adult life, just so I could say thank you to her face. You found her in 10 seconds, and you used her for a laugh." He shook his head again, slow. "I don't know who you are." Marcus Whitfield had commanded divisions. He had been received by senators. And now he stood in the center of a ballroom he had walked into like a king an hour ago. And he had nothing. No rank that counted in this room. No wife on his arm. No son at his side. No story left that made him the hero of it. Only 200 witnesses, and one small, polished truth in a green dress, who had beaten him without ever once raising her voice. He had spent his whole life making sure he was the most important man in every room he entered. And it had taken one quiet woman, one worn wrist, and a single sentence about catering to show him that he had never, not once, understood what importance actually was. They gave her the medal that night, the way it was always meant to be given, in front of the flags, with the citation read slowly so that every word had room to land. When the general lifted the pale blue ribbon over her head and settled the small, heavy star against the green gown. Amara Diallo did not stand taller or prouder. She stood exactly as she had stood by the bar an hour before. Calm, contained. A woman who had already carried far heavier things than a medal against that same chest. Then they asked her to say something, and the room that had laughed at her went so quiet you could hear the chandeliers hum. "I am not going to talk about the plateau," she said. "The men who were there already know, and the ones who were not do not need the details to understand it. I will only say this. I did not hold that ridgeline alone. A boy from Houston named Jabari Okonkwo held it with me. And he is the reason 14 men came home, and he did not. And every good thing I have been given since that night belongs partly to him." She let that sit in the silence. People spent this evening surprised that someone like me could be someone like this. I have spent my whole life watching people decide who I am by what I have on. A uniform, a green dress, an apron. So, here is the only thing I know for certain after all of it. The person you look right through in the room, the one you wave toward the service door, the one you decide is nobody worth your time. That is very often the exact person holding the line that you are standing safely behind. Be kind to the people you have decided are beneath you. You are almost never standing as high up as you think you are. She did not look at the general when she said it. She did not have to. Nobody in that room would ever forget who the sentence was for. In the weeks that followed, the story went where such stories go now. Everywhere, all at once. The footage of a beaming lieutenant general mocking a Medal of Honor recipient he had mistaken for catering, and then being forced to salute her while his own son wept openly beside her, became the kind of thing the whole country watched and argued about over dinner. Lieutenant General Marcus Whitfield's name was quietly withdrawn from consideration for the post everyone had sworn was already his. There was a review. There was a statement full of the word regret. There was, in the end, an early retirement dressed up in language designed to sound like a choice. The 4th star was never his. Sonia did not stay for the part where the invitations stopped coming. She was gone by spring, and the grand house went on the market. And the man who had once walked into every room like a king learned what it was to walk into a room and watch it go quiet, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with awe. Amara did not celebrate any of it. That was never what she had come for. What she did was open a video call to a small apartment in Surulere, Lagos, where a gray-haired Yoruba woman named Mama Okonkwo still kept a bedroom exactly the way her son had left it 9 years ago. Amara sat at a small kitchen table for a long afternoon and told her in detail, for the very first time, exactly what Jabari had done on the plateau. How he had read the wind like scripture, how he had kept a running list of the meals he was going to eat when he got home, how he had put his body between the danger and hers without a heartbeat of hesitation, and died a spotter's death, watching over someone else to the last. And then Amara took the worn brass medallion that Andrew had pressed into her palm, the one the 14 men had carried for 9 years, and she held it up to the camera. "They made this for the person your son saved," she said. "So it belongs with the person who made him." Mama Okonkwo did not speak for a long time. Then she said, in Yoruba, "Iyami Aje," the way her son used to say it when he was a small boy and the house was dark. Amara started something with his name on it. The Jabari Fund. For the families of the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who serve in the quiet places and come home to nothing. Or do not come home at all. In its first year, the Jabari Fund put the daughter of a fallen Nigerian reconnaissance soldier through her first year of university. paid off the medical debt of an army spotter who came home in pieces the country never bothered to count, and quietly covered a funeral for a family that could not afford to bury their own son. None of it ever made the news. Amara preferred it exactly that way. The whole point, she told Andrew, was to be the thing that shows up in the dark when nobody is watching and nobody will ever know. Because she had been saved by exactly that kind of thing once, on a mountain. And she intended to spend the rest of her life paying the debt forward, one quiet name at a time. Andrew runs the fund alongside her now. He still calls her ma'am. She still tells him to stop. He never will. He brings his daughter to Ankara Lane on her birthday every year, and half the town has finally started to wonder about the calm woman who cuts them cloth. And she has slowly, at long last, stopped minding if they find out. She still wears long sleeves most days. But now, sometimes, when a kid at the counter is having a hard week, or a young soldier home on leave wanders in looking lost and hollowed out, she rolls her cuff back a couple of inches on purpose and lets them see the ink on her wrist. And she tells them the truth that cost her everything and saved 14 lives. That the quiet ones are watching over them. That the overlooked ones are so often the ones holding the line. That you never, ever know who is standing right next to you at the bar. A strange and wonderful thing happened in the months after the video spread. Amara started getting letters. Not from admirals, not from reporters, from the invisible people. A janitor who had mopped the same office floors for 30 years. A home health aide nobody had ever once thanked. A quiet kid in a small town who had been told his whole life that he was nobody and had very nearly come to believe it. They all said some version of the very same thing. I saw what she told that general about the service door, and I stood up a little straighter today. She answered every last one of them, by hand. She figured she owed them that much, because she had been each of them at some point, and because a line held in the dark is only ever worth the people standing safe behind it. JB would have laughed at the size of the mail pile, she thought, and then he would have read every letter twice. And every morning, before she flips the sign on the door, she still closes her fingers around a dog tag that is not hers, for the length of one single breath. Only now, his name has been spoken in the light, in a room full of the living. And she can, at last, let the tag rest warm against her chest instead of cold. If this story moved you, if you have ever been the person somebody waved toward the service door, tell us about it in the comments below. Subscribe and stay a while, because we tell the stories of the overlooked and the underestimated here. And share this one with somebody who needs the reminder tonight. Because sometimes, the person you almost mistook for nobody is a saint with a mark on her wrist. And you are standing safely behind a line she is still holding. Like, comment, subscribe. Tell us where you are watching from.